Hi, David. Welcome back to the People Quotient Podcast. Good to have you back.
Nice to see you again, Rohit.
David, for those just dialing in, this is our third episode in the series on leadership and leadership development. And as appropriate as that name is, this episode is on leadership. And so we previously covered in our first episode peak performing teams or high performing teams. And then I think the second episode we covered peak performing individuals. And we talked a lot about how leaders, especially exceptional leaders, identify peak performing individuals, motivate them, and actually that results in high performing teams. And so a lot of what we referred to in our first few episodes, we'll touch on now as to how it gets done by a leader. But, leader is a very overused term, I feel. Like everybody talks about being a leader, leadership, being some this sort of, a thing that people strive to be. When you think about leader or leadership, where does one start? So if I'm a CEO listening in, why should I listen to another episode on leadership is my first question. And maybe you can expand on as how you've led people through that journey and why what we're about to talk about separates this conversation from hundreds of other conversations out there on leadership and being a leader.
Yeah. So as I think about it, there is a huge difference between being a leader and demonstrating leadership. Being a leader is a title that one carries. It's a role that you occupy. You may be promoted into it. You may be elected into it. You may be suddenly find yourself in it one day because of organizational circumstances. But it's a title that one carries. Leadership is a set of behaviors that one displays. And in that sense, therefore, leadership can emerge anywhere, regardless of the title that you carry. But for those that actually occupy the role of a leader, however we may define that, is it a CEO? Is it a manager? Is it a coach at a football club? Is it a prime minister? Then the question becomes, I am a leader because of the role that I'm performing, because of the title that I carry, but to what extent am I demonstrating leadership? And is it the kind of leadership that I aspire others to experience me demonstrating? And I think for me, that helps to define the difference between these two concepts.
Yeah, and one thing I'd point out to those listening is like, you these are not hypotheticals for you. You have worked with a prime minister, you've worked with, soccer coaches around the world at international level. You've worked with professional athletes and executive CEOs of Fortune 50. So when you say that, you're not saying it as a throwaway comment. Maybe that's the difference between some of the other content that's out there versus what we're about to talk about is you're coming at it, having looked at it through both private sector, public sector, corporate, as well as sports. And so, that blend and that experience is what we want to bring to the listeners in this series. And so one thing that you brought up is this point about aspirational leader. And we hear a lot about inspirational leaders. So can you talk a little bit about like how you think about, if I'm somebody who's aspiring to be a leader, wants to be a leader, should I try to be an aspirational leader or an inspirational leader, or do I have to be both? Like, again, how do I work my way through the maze of this leadership jargon that's out there?
Yeah. So the quick and easy answer is be both. But there is a reason. There's a reason that I say that. You started off this conversation a few minutes ago, Rohit, by saying we talk about leader or leadership a lot. And you're right. And what we don't talk about, which is what I talk about with the leaders that I work with, is the notion of followership.
Yeah.
For me, it's a much more powerful route into thinking about what kind of leader do I want to be and what leadership behaviors do I want to stand for, do I want to demonstrate. It's hard to lead if nobody is following, right? Yes. And therefore, the notion of followership is really important. And it speaks to where we've evolved to with this notion of inspirational versus aspirational leadership. Inspirational leadership for me is how I lead others. Aspirational leadership is the flip side of that same coin, and it describes how others experience me leading myself. And therefore, followership is created on both sides of this coin. Followership for some comes from how you lead me, and followership for others comes from how I observe you leading yourself. And it's that package. It's the package of both aspirational and inspirational leadership for me as a leader to think about how am I creating followership, and I create it on both sides of that coin.
Is that on the piece around aspirational leadership? Some people growing up, everybody says lead by example. Is that where that it ties into, like leading by example? Does that tie into the aspirational side of leadership?
It does, but that's one strand. It's so fundamental. Let me give you an example. It is quite possible, and I've experienced some leaders who we won't mention, who fall into the category I'm about to describe. It is quite possible to be an inspirational leader that nobody wants to be like, because one sees that leader leading themselves in a way that when you look at them, you say, it can't be like that. I don't want to be like that. I don't want to make those sacrifices. I don't want to be treating people in that way. I don't want to make those trade-offs. And yet, the way that person leads me, they create opportunities for me. They coach me. They open doors for me. They're stretching my belief in myself to help me move to a new level. I love all that side of it. But when I see what I perceive to be the personal price they're paying for their leadership capability, I don't want to be like that. And for me, that is a waste. That is a waste of some great inspirational qualities that clearly exist in that person, in that leader. But because he or she is not thinking about how they're leading themselves and what kind of imagery that projects on their followers, it keeps their ability to create followership. And at its worst, it starts to reduce followership, particularly among those who are looking for balance, who are looking for long-term sustainability in their own leadership practice.
Yeah, I've just a lot of bing bings going in my head right now because, I'm thinking about and sort of reflecting on my own self and those that I know. You're absolutely right. Being an inspirational leader is not everything. It's when I'm thinking about specific people who've inspired me throughout my career, like and who've actually created opportunities for me, but the cost in which they've led it. And I've walked away from jobs. I've walked away from roles where there was an opportunity to step into something bigger for that lack of aspirational side. Because I think, and again, it's not about money, it's not about titles. It was about like, okay, if in order to live that way, if that is the model, I choose not to. And as a result, and I wasn't the only one. There are a lot of other people also walked away. And so it is very interesting. So what you're saying for those listening, it's almost a question to those leaders listening is that, are you an aspirational leader? It's almost like that is a bigger thing to shoot for. And then, because if you're not that, yes, you can be an inspirational leader. If you're not that, then obviously you've got to work on both. But being an aspirational leader is sort of the ultimate place to be, because not only that allows you to live a better, fulfilling personal life, but that takes your leadership, to your point about followership, your leadership to the next level, because more people would want to follow you.
Yes, right? Absolutely. And the interesting point about the personal example that you give there, Rohit, is that leader, that person that you were recalling, probably never gets to know the reason you or others didn't stick around was because of the reasons that you've just described. And that's the danger, right? That's the danger for a leader. And actually, the more senior you become as a leader, the lonelier it tends to become. And therefore, your ability as a leader to look inwards, have a balcony moment from time to time for yourself, right? On the dimensions of inspirational and aspirational leadership is absolutely crucial, because you don't get that information, you don't get that data from others in exactly the way that you've just described. And unless that person, unless that leader is working with a coach, for example, who may be able to share their own observations with that leader or conduct a number of independent 360s in order to generate some of that information, some of that data, then the risk for leaders is you don't know. You don't have the information that helps you recognize this in and of yourself.
No, I completely agree. And I think I agree with the point around being lonely at the top. You know, I've been there, I feel that a lot. And often it is a really hard job, right? Being a leader, whether, again, titles aside, if you are leading a team, you're leading a company, you're leading a country, you know, it is a start, like, where do you turn to? Like, because, you know, the other side of the coin is vulnerability. Like, you know, how can you be vulnerable? Because inherently people still view that as a weakness. But I think it actually speaks to, from what you're describing, the aspirational side, because if you as a leader are able to demonstrate that that's how you are, your openness to learn, develop, you know, be introspective, take feedback, coaching, mentorship, it will inspire and give other people more to work with, saying, well, hang on, that's the really good balanced way, because it's not one and done. And I think that's whether it's a mentorship model or whether it's, as you say, 360, all of those tools allow you to get data in. Is there anybody that you worked with that really stands out who had, in your opinion, has struck that balance in a nice way during the course of their career?
Yes, absolutely. I would say if we were looking at the world of sport, say, to start with, I think one of the most impressive people I've ever worked with, frankly, not just in the world of sport, but ever worked with, full stop, Xabi Alonso, former Spanish midfielder, now super successful manager at Bayer Leverkusen in the Bundesliga in Germany. And Xabi he always had a clear sense of purpose. So what do I mean by that? Part of what I mean by that is, I think sometimes in life, whatever walk of life we're in, we can start to identify ourselves by what we do rather than by who we are. And if what you do has a finite lifespan, which for most of us, I would argue for all of us, it does. For a footballer, it certainly does. And it usually comes at some point in your 30s. Then you're in trouble, right, for the rest of your life, because what you do ends. And if your identity is what you do and what you do ends, then... Yeah. And Xabi was always one of those that saw himself as more than what he did. There was always, from a career standpoint, there was always a longer term plan. He was a several horizon, still is, a several horizon thinker. But beyond that, there was always a sense of, because I am more than what I do, what else is important to me in life? And how am I making sure that I give time and attention to those things?
Yep.
So anyone listening in or watching us may have heard of his name, may be aware even of some of his achievements, but will know very little about him. Won't have read much about him on various media outlets, because he was more than what he did. And he was off spending time nurturing those things that were important to him in life. And what this did was, those around him, those teammates around him, fans of his, those leaders to whom he was answerable, the coach when he was a player, the board of the club, the owner of the club, the leaders in his sponsoring organizations, and so on. He was leading them. He was leading them as a 20-something, as a 30-something, because someone who has this greater sense of purpose, there is something quite magnetic about someone that operates in that space, who is more than what they do, who has this greater sense of purpose about their life, who has a very clear picture of what's important to them and why, and what's not important to them, and is actively taking control of choices in their life based on that sense of purpose that they have. And certainly from all the people that I've worked with and observed, he would be one of the standouts.
Yeah.
Both in purity terms, because that's who he was and who he is, but also maybe because it was a surprise. You know, maybe because we don't expect that of a sport person or a footballer in particular. But there he was.
So, one of the things that pops out in my head is, I'm sort of like putting myself in the shoes of those listening in, which is like, okay, David, I buy that I need to have a bigger than my role purpose, because you are right. A lot of people, given the grind of a job, whether you're a CEO or a middle manager or somebody wanting to be a middle manager or a CEO, everyone's trying to prove themselves, and it's a competitive world out there. And so it's very easy to become your job, become your title, become the role that you're playing. And most of us spend a lot more time at our jobs or thinking or in our jobs through our heads, even if physically we're not there, than actually doing other things. So how was it that Xabi, with such enormous responsibility, and obviously he's achieved a lot, having, recently won Bundesliga last season, how does one do that? How does one create that balance? Because really what you're talking about, going back to your point about aspirational leaders, you've got to create the space to be able to allow other things in while also being stellar at your job and excel, so you can, continue to enjoy what you do, but also enjoy the success that comes with it. A lot of people can barely do one thing really, really well, me included. I'm like, so when I hear that, I'm like, man, I'd love to do that. So what are things that either Xabi or others like him do principally as a practice that would allow others like us to say, oh, I could try that, or here are some ways to create that space?
Yeah. So yes, and it's not as not to put Xabi down, but he's not special in the sense that what he does and what others do is available to us all. I think this is the sense that I'm taking of the point that you're raising, Rohit. But we have to become purposeful.
Yeah.
This is the thing. It doesn't just happen. I think the best leaders are purposeful, not just about what they do, which is the trap that most of us fall into, but purposeful also about how they do it. Because I think this is where the real heart of inspirational in particular, but also aspirational leadership really lives. And we get caught up on the treadmill of the busyness, of the achievement, the what side of life, rather than how do I go about achieving the what's in life? Because that's really where inspiration and aspiration comes from. It's not so much about what I do, it's much more about how I do it. And do I have congruence between what I say and what I do?
Yeah.
Do I have congruence between how I lead you and how I'm leading myself? So, for example, and we can expand on this if it's of interest to you, but as you know, I was a leadership advisor to McKinsey and Company for 19 years or so. And during that time, with some people and organizations elsewhere that I was working with, and with some organizations who were clients of McKinsey, I conducted quite a lot of research into what are the most key common components, behaviors that lead to inspirational and aspirational behavior. What's the overlap and what's the commonality in key behaviors? And the precise number escapes me, so forgive me. But I spoke to somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 people in a vast variety of organizations and walks of life and levels in organizations. And so let me give you an example, going back to my other point that came out from that research. One of the elements that I ended up putting into a framework of the work that came out of this was the notion of care and commitment. And it has a dual aspect. It applies to how I lead others, and it applies to how I lead myself. I could be the most caring leader out there in terms of leading others. I create opportunities for people, going back to a point I was making before. I create opportunities for people. I talk to people beyond just the job itself. I have a genuine care and interest in them as human beings. I purposefully pursue opportunities and options to help them grow, to help them develop, both from a skills point of view and from a human point of view. I coach them, etc., etc. But am I doing those things for myself? Do I have a coach? What new opportunities am I pursuing? Or am I doing the same old? Do I show as much care for myself and the balance that I'm creating in my life as I show for the people that I lead and the balance I'm encouraging them to strike in their life? Because if I don't, there's no congruence. And followership gets nervous when there isn't congruence, right? He or she is saying all these things to me, and I find that unbelievably empowering and inspiring, yet I don't observe them doing the same things for themselves.
Yeah.
That's not congruent, and that's not aspirational.
Right.
So if the only way of being an inspiring leader is to do all those things and encourage all those things in me and in others, but not in yourself as a leader, that's not the kind of leader I aspire to be. So maybe I'll never be an inspirational leader because I'm not willing to pay that price.
Yeah. One of the things that came up as you were talking was this point around consistency. You talked about care and commitment, and then I think you touched on it indirectly, but I'd love to kind of go deeper on the point around being consistent with your leadership, both consistent for self, to your point, as well as others, but also consistent in the how. Because I've often found that there are a lot of leaders with titles, and we'll get into that in a bit, but you've already sort of touched on that titles don't define leaders. And I completely agree. You can have leadership being exhibited without titles, which is your point. But I do find people uninspiring and aspirationally not the best when consistency is missing, yet they have the title and authority to, basically direct traffic. And so that's where I found a lot of people who are in the followership zone or our followers get pretty down, pretty sort of like, they'll leave, they walk away, and if they have the choice, because not everybody does. So where does consistency in your model of care and commitment sit? Is that a third leg of the stool, or is that a subset of commitment as you're describing it from the data that you looked at?
Yeah, I think it's it's within the framework that I was talking about, which we can elaborate on in a moment. But consistency is a huge component of leading yourself, right? Because it's from that you build a self-reflective practice. In order to be the great leader of others, you have first of all to be a great leader of yourself, right?
Yeah.
This is not a selfish thing to do, right? And we must be very clear on the words here. It is not selfish as a leader to look after yourself first in order to be the best you can be for others, right? To nurture others, You've got to be nurtured. To inspire others, you've got to be inspired. So figuring those things out for yourself, building that picture for yourself, being consistent in how you live that, therefore, not only does that take care of or go a long way to looking after this notion of I an aspirational leader through the way that I'm living my life, but it's the foundation stone to then be powerful leader of others.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about that framework that you were describing a few minutes ago as to what are some of the other components, because I am, the thing that goes to my mind is I know a lot of people who are consistently bad leaders.
Yeah.
So they're consistent, but they're in the, they shouldn't be in the, and I won't again name names myself, but there are plenty, and anyone listening can point to at least one consistently bad leader. Yeah. And so what you're saying is like, you're describing consistency in a different way. You're describing selfishness in a different way. than the traditional sense. And so I think rather than me trying to mine it, why don't we start with the framework that you came up with? Because I think that'll help a lot of us listening to start to put some of these things together in our heads.
Yeah. So there are two, what I described as foundational elements. And then there are three elements that may live differently in each of us. We will have a natural home in at least one of them. We will have a natural weaker in one of them. We don't have to be off the charts on them all, but the more interesting that I use this word, the more awareness, you'll see why in a moment, the more awareness we have of each of those ways in which we deliver leadership, the other three elements, the more awareness we have of those, the more people we are likely to reach in terms of creating followership. So the two foundational elements are awareness and sense of purpose. And let me come back to those in a minute. But suffice it to say that they were the bedrock of both inspirational and aspirational leadership, right? Okay. So we're coming back to those. The other three elements, the other three pairs of elements, remember, these are the way in which we deliver, we live, we demonstrate inspirational and aspirational leadership. One of them, I touched on before, care and commitment. Another is energy and optimism. And the final one is courage and conviction. So if we think about sense of purpose to describe as an example how each of these five elements, awareness, sense of purpose, care and commitment, energy and optimism, courage and conviction, each of those has a strand about it that is about leading others. Each of them have a strand about them which is about leading yourself. Let's take sense of purpose. Leading myself. Do I have a sense of purpose? Do I know what's important to me and therefore what isn't? Do I know where I'm heading? Do I know what I stand for? Do I know what my values are? Am I making choices that are consistent and congruent with that sense of purpose? Am I willing to take control of my decisions in order to live my sense of purpose? But that's about how I'm leading myself. How I'm leading others on that same dimension. How do I create a shared sense of purpose with those that I lead? How do I create a shared sense of purpose with my career colleagues? How do I create a shared sense of purpose with my friends and those that are important to me? How do I create a shared sense of purpose at home? No, this is a whole life. This is a whole of life framework. This is not just leadership in the classic sense. Oh, I'm at work now, leader, right? I need to demonstrate leadership. What about the rest of your life? Where are you demonstrating leadership there? Because this has a role to play in both aspirational and inspirational leadership. You know, and I mentioned the care and commitment aspect before. How am I demonstrating that to those that I lead? And how are they experiencing me demonstrating that to myself?
It's really helpful, because what's interesting is that obviously awareness is it's almost like without that, to your point about being foundational, if I had to pick one of the five and one of the two, I would personally pick awareness, because without that awareness, you're not even sure if you have a sense of purpose and are you aware of it. And then how are you, as you said, how are you leading others, to your point? And when others could be, to your point about your community, your friends, yourself, people around you. And so whether it's one person or 1,000 or 100,000. And so the question really comes down to is, are you aware of, and also I think the thing that you touched on previously is how others perceive you to come out. So being aware of other people's perception of you is a really interesting place to be. That's like a next level of awareness. And so would you, for those people who are, sort of starting to process a lot of this, these are great tools, but how does one remember this? How does one, if I'm on the go, I've got a board meeting coming up, I'm doing an M&A transaction, I've got to think about promoting some people because it's year end and budgets are being formed. There's a lot going on, and that's just my day job, right? There might be a few other things, to your point, even though I'm living a more purposeful life. and it's obviously a hypothetical, keeping in mind a CEO or somebody who's running a business. How do I remind myself of these five, elements, and in particular, what I would call it, the mega element of awareness? How do people do that? Are there people that you work with who've demonstrated that consistently and given you ideas of how that can be done by the rest of us?
Yeah. So let me pick up on the last point first. Whether I name it, whether I label it as such or not, every person that I have worked with as a coach, I've had them work on this aspirational framework, or certainly at least those two foundational elements. Because we only act on things when they're in our conscious mind.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how smart we are. It doesn't matter how much we know or believe or accept this kind of stuff. Unless it's in our conscious mind, we won't act on it. So a lot of the work that I do is about, first of all, helping you to put it into your conscious mind, and then helping you think of tactics that when I'm not there anymore for a while or forever, you can still recall these things. You have a self-sustained practice that allows you to continue to be the most powerful leader, demonstrating the kind of leadership behaviors that are important to you that you can be going forward. Yeah. So, but you're right on awareness. Awareness there's a reason that it's one of the foundational elements, and there's a reason why it comes before sense of purpose in the order of the framework. Absolutely fundamental. And I always tie this in with a phrase that I always use. You'll recognize it. You and I have talked about it before, Rohit. We are human beings, not human doings. But how much of our lives are caught up in doing rather than in being? That is true for all of us. It is particularly true for those that occupy a leadership role, the role of a leader. And it becomes even truer the more senior leader you become. And therefore, getting purposeful about thinking about being rather than just doing, not only in my humble view, is important to all of us, but it becomes increasingly important the more senior you become in the role that you occupy.
Yeah.
Why is that the case? Because it is from being, it's from stepping off the treadmill, it's from having those moments. And I'd love to come back and talk and define further moments if we have chance to it. Because it's not as onerous as it may sound, but it's having those moments where you can check in with yourself. How am I doing against the things that I said were important to me? How am I doing in the how of being a leader, not just in the what? We're very good at checking in on the what. What have I achieved? Have I hit these numbers? Have I hit my targets? Have I delivered the results? Did we open those stores? Did we hit that bottom line number? Did we get good feedback from the board? Et cetera, et cetera. We're very good at automatically checking in on the, but we're pretty appalling at checking in on the how. And if you really want to be the best leader you can be, it has to be a combination. You can't forget the what's. You've still got the achievements to accomplish, but thinking about the how am I doing that, that's where the sustainability of leadership comes from. That's really where the followership for many comes from. And that requires checking in. And checking in requires you to get out of doing and to get a little bit more into being. That's where consistency and congruence and longevity as a leader, for those that are interested in not just being an overnight sensation, but remaining for a long time, this is where it will come.
Yeah, it's interesting. You bring up a point where I often talk about short-term leader and long-term leader, and I sort of coined it not because because that's the simplest way I could have described it, which is, you can be a short-term leader and not in this ultra short-term that you were describing, which is the overnight sensation, but you can be a leader in a moment in time for a company or in a role or in a sports team, wherever you are, to your point, when you've got others following you, right, in your community. But I think to the point that you're making, how I think about long term, and you probably have a better way of describing this, is when you create others who are leaders, right? When you're creating other leaders who are, to your point, looking at you aspirationally, and you've actually inspired, and through your work, they're now like, oh, you know what? I want to be like David. And so I think that brings me to that point about, have you seen people who are, when you think about leadership in terms of distinctiveness, is that what makes people from a great leader to a distinctive leader, or distinctive leaders those who have many other leaders they build in the organization, whether proactively or through organic work? Or is there a different way to take leadership to a next level of distinctiveness? Because there are a lot of people who'll be like, hey, look, you know what? I'm listening in. I've run a lot of companies. I've invested in a lot of companies. I've run a lot of teams. Like, I think where to next?
Yes.
Is that where it goes next?
The most distinctive leaders and the most distinctive organizations, frankly, that I've worked with are those who have as one of their primary purposes the task of creating leaders who are better than themselves. They purposefully create leadership behavior. They allow it to flourish around them, and out of that emerges people who are then ready to occupy the role, to take the title of a leader in that organization or elsewhere. And the joy, the achievement of the leader who's enabled that to happen is in seeing others achieve. And through that, believing that they have achieved by creating other leaders who are often better than themselves. I'll give you two quite different corporate entities that I've worked with that has a purpose. One is McKinsey & Company, who we talked about before, and one would be the Red Bull racing team, right, in Formula One. And amongst the primary purposes of both organizations is to talk about leadership as being a set of behaviors that anyone can demonstrate, and acknowledging that wherever it exists in the organization. But beyond that, purposefully encouraging and enabling that as part of the values, the beliefs, not just of the organization, but of the individual senior leaders in that organization, to cascade that throughout. And many people have left those organizations to go on to become very senior leaders, influential figures in other organizations. McKinsey is probably the most prime example, just because of its size and scale. I really don't know what the number is, but it will be a big number of CEOs out there who are former McKinsey people. That's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
So this note of, I think that amongst the most distinctive people that I've ever worked with, amongst the most distinctive organizations I've ever been involved with, are those who have it as part of their ethos, individually and collectively, is to grow leadership behaviors, therefore to grow leaders that are beyond the current and are ready for the future.
Yeah, it goes back to the thing that we talked about in the previous episodes. When we talked about in the first episode in this series on building high-performing teams and really sort of looking at the roles people can play throughout the organization, there were some within a smaller team or a large team, there are roles. Sometimes CEOs take on that role of a visionary, but they don't have to. And similarly, there are people who would question, and we talked a little bit about how consultants are often those people who are critical about an idea because naturally they're sort of, wired to do some more diligence. And so what you're getting at, so fast forward to this episode, is leadership behaviors can be demonstrated at any level. And the fact is that the company, those listening in, whatever organization you're from, if you're purposefully promoting the development of others into leaders by having leadership traits be part of your core value system, I think you can achieve that high-performing team status, eventually and consistently, and get to that peak performance that we all sort of strive for as people who are, working really hard to achieve something. And so I think that I'm sort of connecting the dots that being in I think being in a leadership position is a privilege, one that, a lot of us see as a privilege, but not everyone. And then being aware of that privilege and then what it can be, what it can do is a place where I think where you're getting at is allowing the next generation to come through. I often joke with my teams that I'd love to be the most irrelevant human in the room at the end of the day, because I would love to be in a place where the teams don't need me. And I think that same aspiration for me is that keeps me honest in saying, how can I make sure everyone in the room is contributing in their own way and demonstrating some elements of leadership through the process? And I think, do I do it all the time? Absolutely not. But is that something that's top of mind? Yes. And so I think what you're getting at is consistent practice, making sure that you're aware, and really one thing that I think you wanted to come back to was this point around moments. It also brought me back to the conversation we had in the last episode about balcony moments, that peak performing individuals have a balcony moment. And I think tying that to this point around leaders have their moments in their practice. Do you want to talk a little bit about how those who are either not doing a lot of this work or doing some of this work can make this as part of their practice? So after this episode, at least they can have a toolkit to say, okay, I'm going to do one thing that will make me a better leader from prior to listening to this conversation.
Yeah. So I think, there's groundwork, and then there are the moments that I was referring to, the being rather than doing moment, right?
Yeah.
The being moments are all about checking in on how am I doing against the things that I said were important to me as a person and as a leader. And those things are defined in the groundwork. And the groundwork is really around those foundational elements of the framework that I was talking about around awareness and sense of purpose. Right. So on awareness, I would typically do an exercise with people around what is important to me. Who am I? Who do I want to be? How do I want people to experience me? If someone was to go out and interview the people that I lead, or the most important people in my life, or whatever category, whatever you want to define, what would I want them to be saying about me? What are the words that I would want them to be using about me? And as I think about those words, how would I need to be behaving? What behaviors would I need to be demonstrating in order for people to use those words as descriptors of me as a person, or as a leader, or as a father, or as a friend? Again, I would encourage people to be as holistic about this as possible.
Yep.
You're defining that script for yourself, if you like, around the awareness. And on the sense of purpose, it's thinking about, and what do I want to do with my life? What do I want to achieve? Why are those things important to me? But then also, as we touched on, how do I want to achieve those things, right? How do I want to be on my journey to achievement? Who do I want to carry along with me? What do I want to create around me as I'm on that journey? And that becomes your check-in. So when you're in your being moments, when you're stepping off the treadmill, you're checking in. How am I doing against the things that I said were important to me about who I am, about what my values are, about how I'm living my life, about the behaviors that I'm demonstrating, about the impact that I'm having on people around me, on how they would be describing me? How am I doing on those things? Where am I doing well? And where I am doing well, how am I doing that? So that I don't just leave it to chance, but that I start to double down on those things. And where am I not doing so well? And what's the reason for that? What's getting in the way? And that becomes your self-sustaining, reflective, human being series of moments. You don't have to go on a retreat for 2 weeks, right, to think about these things. You just need moments. And it's the consistency of small moments that helps you to deliver the consistency then of your actual behaviors. Is what I'm saying to myself what I'm actually living? And if it is, fantastic. How do I make sure I keep that going? And if it isn't, what am I going to do about it?
I think One of the exercises that I do with a lot of CEOs that I work with, and again, what I enjoy the most is building companies, and obviously it's all about the people, hence the name of the podcast. But is effectively a self-reflective scorecard. So I think what you're describing is a bit of that. Slightly different ones, but I call it the awareness sort of scorecard, and in different stages. So depending on whether somebody is leading a large organization that's going through transformative change, and or somebody who's actually in that sort of middle management in a large business unit, whatever your situation is, the elements are slightly different because you're in a different part of the journey depending on the organization. So it is a bit more of an operational awareness scorecard, but it is what you're describing, which is allowing the person to create that moment for themselves. And then I often tell people, every time we talk, let's just put that on your calendar every quarter, and make sure you put it on someone else's calendar too, so they can remind you. And it's about self accountability, and it is hard because a lot of us get buried with work, and it's really hard to sort of say, okay, I'll get to it. And you deprioritize this. That your counsel and coaching here is, if you wish to be a leader of any organization or team, and you wish to build high performing teams to achieve that, which includes peak performing individuals, then you've got to have this practice, because absent this practice, you've got no shot. I think you can get lucky, and luck has never been most people, at least my strategy. So if you want to be consistently performing at that level, you've got to have this practice, which actually brings me to a topic, David, that I often come across is when I'm working with organizations and especially boards that are trying to bring in a new CEO, I often hear this conversation about charismatic leader. I often ask that question, what are you solving for in your CEO? And, I get this word charismatic, and I often don't know how to process it, because I'm not sure if that definition jives well in my head to what an organization might need. Is that something that when you have worked with, you've worked with obviously McKinsey and the Red Bull Racing and public sector, where does that manifest, and what does that mean? And should people or companies be thinking about charismatic leaders, or is there a better way to really think about that charisma that people get enamored by?
Yeah. There'll be a lot of people, I suspect, listening in and recoiling at the word charismatic, right? Because how many of us really, really believe we are charismatic, right? So, it feels like it's a high thing to reach for, right? So most of us would recoil at that, thinking, well, I'm never going to get recruited for that role because, hey, I'm not rah, bouncing off the walls with this unbelievably crazy character and so on. A cold shiver goes through me when I'm sat in a room and the board are recruiting for a charismatic leader. Some of the often quietest people, Xabi Alonso, who we were talking about before, some leaders that I've worked with at Peloton, many leaders that I've worked with at McKinsey, some people that I've worked with at the Global Fund at the United Nations, immediately just coming to mind. I would actually describe them as very quiet people, but my word, they were inspirational and aspirational leaders. So I say that, Rohit, to your point, I just caution against the word charismatic, because for most of us, it conjures up a very particular image of a person, a very particular definition of how they might show up. And I think it does a disservice to those who are quieter, but unbelievably powerful as people and as leaders, right? So to me, it's a surface level descriptor. And I'd be much more interested in what are the behaviors that we want and or need in the leader of our organization or our team or our department, or again, whatever your circumstances are. What are the behaviors that we want a leader to demonstrate? And if those behaviors manifest and are produced by somebody who is, if we define it that way, charismatic, terrific. And if those behaviors are demonstrated by someone who is, let's put it this way, quieter, terrific. It's the behaviors that we want, not the headline, because the headline, we're all going to have various definitions and interpretations of it. And some of us will be attracted to or scared away from that headline definition. But we can all, I think, more easily align and get excited by the type of behaviors, the type of principles, the type of values, the type of beliefs that we want our company leader, our department leader, whatever it might be, to demonstrate.
Yeah, I think it's spot on, because I often go back to, the simple questions of what are you solving for? And I think every organization has something very specific. So the question usually for the board or for the CEO looking for someone else on their team, quote unquote, charismatic, is like, first let's go back to what are you solving for, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and then sort of develop a version of what that would look like, rather than this word charismatic. I just sort of ask because it comes up so often. I do have one question that when you look at the world of politics, and we won't spend too much time in politics, but that is one place where I do think that I've often seen charisma and ability to impress large masses of crowds, or being able to go influence people who are not on your same side. I often think that in that world, the word charismatic comes up as well. And I know you've worked in the highest levels of British politics and with people who run countries. And so how have you seen that manifest, or is that just an outsider's perception and reality is quite different on the inside?
So the human condition is the human condition. And, meaning we all have our hopes and aspirations. We all have our fears and doubts. We all have our worries and concerns. We all have our self-limiting beliefs. We all have our joys and our pleasures. How all of this shows up can sometimes look very different depending on the walk of life that you happen to be on. So what politicians tend to be good at is certainly senior politicians. They tend to be good at communication. They tend to be good at telling a story, okay? Without getting into the politics of it, because, you're right, you're either switched on or switched off, depending on the politician and the party and the policies and so on. So if we strip that away and just talk about the art of mobilizing support and engagement, if you can't do that in politics, you are really going to struggle. If we just think about it as an art form, and yes, there are some people to whom that comes more easily, and you might describe those as the more charismatic.
Yeah.
There are others who have to work on it a bit more, and you might describe that, those people as you wouldn't put them in the charismatic bracket, but you would say, my goodness me, that was an unbelievably powerful speech. I love that. That really moved me, or that really engaged me, even if you don't see that person as a naturally charismatic person. I think the lesson for the rest of us that I would encourage us all to think about is you've got to be true to yourself.
Yeah.
Don't try to be what you're not, right?
Yeah.
Don't believe you have to be charismatic in order to be a good leader. Not true.
Yeah.
Or that you have to be naturally gifted at something in order to be good at that something. Not true. We can learn these things. And in fact, I would say learning them and then delivering them in your authentic style, with your authentic views and beliefs and your authentic sense of purpose. That's what makes you a powerful leader or a powerful communicator. It's not the charisma. Yeah. It's the root, right? It's the basis from which you are appearing as your true, authentic self. You can work on the skills of delivery, of oratory, and so on. That's a skill. But what's lying at the heart of it? Is it a true, real, passionate, sense of purpose-based, authentic message that you're delivering? You can work on the skill of delivering it, right?
Yeah.
But if you're just great at delivering it, but there's no authenticity at the heart of it,
I think it also brings up the point that you raised up in a case of peak performing individuals, which is this notion of interference, right? I think it sort of ties back to that a lot of us whether we've created this version of whatever charismatic is for ourselves or for other people, it sort of creates a sense of interference that I'm not that. And I think what your counsel is, that's not at all true.
Yeah.
And it is in fact, reducing that. And anyone who's listening now, like if they want to revisit, you go back to that previous episode where we break down how interferences come about and how to actually get rid of them, or at least minimize them to increase your overall performance. I think to me, that's where this sort of ties in really nicely. One thing that you triggered in my head in our last minutes, I was going to talk about two things. One is fake leadership. So I'm taking the flip of it, or failing leadership. People who, especially CEOs listening in, but also people who report into leaders, at some point, fake gets found out, but you would want that to be sooner rather than later. And so do you have any counsel for those who are evaluating leaders in their organizations to say, hey, how to spot a failing or fake leader? So taking a very extreme end of everything we've been talking about, from high performance to the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, that's a thoughtful question. Consistency is one of the things. So, asking a variety of questions to seek that leader's view or example, asking them in different ways. So is there a consistency in the answers or not? That's definitely one. Second order questions are important. And by that, I mean, don't just ask the question, get the answer, and then move on to the next question, which is on a different topic. So instead of going across, go down, dig deeper, go at least 3 levels deep. The great and the good even leaders will be able to do that. The failing and the fake leaders will get stuck very, very quickly because there's no substance, right? There is no substance. It's very surface level. It's trying to tell you what they think they want you to hear or what they're trying to fool you with. And it's the second or third order questions rather than going one here, one next, one next, one next, one next. It's the order, the third order questions that will catch them out. I would talk to and do talk to leaders about values and leadership philosophy and what matters and what doesn't matter. And then ask them to give me examples of where they've lived or where they've led or where they've delivered against those things. Yeah. And again, good, great leaders will be able to answer that with flow, right?
Yeah. No, I'm thinking about people who,
and you'll spot it. So if you're if you're a leader, or if you're an investor, or if you're a board member who is recruiting or who is anxious about the performance of a current leader in your organization, these are the type of things. I would say they are confirmatory things. You'll be able to sniff it, right? Yeah. You will be able to sniff it. Trust your judgment. If something doesn't look right, if something doesn't feel right, if something doesn't smell right, trust that instinct and then use some of these approaches to test that instinct. Don't let it go on for too long because the smell gets greater and it starts to fade through the organization, right? Because they've also got a good sense of smell. So act on your instinct and act early.
That brings me to, our last topic for this on leadership is, we promised our audience that we talk a lot about how leaders lead high-performing individuals. And so one of the biggest things about when you talk about the smell test, I think high-performing individuals are the first to smell fake leadership and inconsistent leadership, because they're the ones who are always looking for ways to improve their performance. And again, people listening in should tune into our last episode. We break a lot down as to what makes people peak performers. But when it comes to leaders managing peak performers or taking peak performers from being great to distinctive, what are some of the things that you would counsel leaders to do? Because managing people who are already amazing, often, I've seen, and I've been guilty of it myself, which is like, if I've got someone amazing on my team, I'll probably pay less attention to them because they can take care of themselves. And I go to the rest of the crew that's struggling. Yet early on in my career, thankfully, I realized that was a big mistake. And separately, I've also seen people lean too heavily on peak performers because they're your right-hand person.
Yeah.
And so they can take more on, which is true because their effectiveness and efficiency is higher, hence they're peak performers, but then that leads to burnout and retention loss. So either way, you end up losing peak performers, which is incredibly detrimental to the organization. So what are some of the ways in which a leader should think about developing and retaining and motivating peak performers and making sure that they continue to enjoy the leadership that one can offer?
Yeah. So I'd say that the first principle is don't see all your peak performers as one group. They're individual, right? So they'll require different things in all likelihood. I think that's got to be, that's a first principle thinking, I think. Don't leave them on their own and isolated. They need care and support too. It's just a different kind of care and support, potentially, than the rest of your team. And I'd say, going back to our framework, how aware are you as a leader of the hopes and aspirations of your peak performers?
Yeah.
Where do they want to go to next? How do they want to grow? What opportunities will allow them to grow in the way that they wish to develop, or you wish them to develop, or the organization needs them to develop? The more aware you can be of the hopes and dreams, the aspirations, the development requirements and aspirations of those peak performers are, the more awareness you have of those things, the more you can help them deliver those things for themselves. So it becomes a tailored approach in that way. And that's one example of why this notion of having awareness of those around you is really important, because that then creates the picture that you can then help them deliver. Where do they need to close the gap? Where can they go from good to great? Where are they already great? And what will it take to make them distinctive? And so on. It's living in those gaps, if you like, understanding what's going to help go from one point through the gap to the next point.
Yeah, that's so true, because I'm
and there's
thinking
a
about
joy,
the people that
there's a joy in that, the leader. There's great in seeing someone make each of those steps to really help someone who's underperforming start to perform, to really help someone who's performing inconsistently to someone who becomes a consistent performer, to someone who's good to taking out, helping them to get to great, and from great to distinct. And there's joy in that. There's inspiration for others in that. And it becomes one of the greatest sources of retaining your top talent, which of course is always a worrisome topic, right? If you're a senior leader, I've got the talent. How the heck now do I retain it, right? Well, these are the kind of avenues that will allow you to retain that top talent. And sometimes, eventually, again, it's a mindset here. There is joy in eventually allowing that talent to leave.
Yeah.
Because it's been developed, it's been nurtured, it's been inspired, and now it's ready for something bigger that you and your organization maybe can't provide for that talent. And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it reminds me, I was having a conversation with the co-founder of Dive Biosciences, Ryan Beal, who's a former McKinsey. And one of the things that he does really well, which goes back to your last point, is that when people move on, because he built a startup and it's a biopharma, so long lead time, so talent usually looking for a next opportunity, and they just don't have the runway available. And so he said his exits, when amazing people left, he celebrates that, because it allows and then creates a bond and a larger. He calls the people who leave as the alumni of the company, but they're not everyone treats that way, and a lot of CEOs take it very personally when somebody quits. A lot of managers feel insulted when someone who's high performing takes a bigger job or a bigger title or moves to a new location, because they've got an opportunity to expand themselves even more. But I think what Ryan's counsel was like, actually, you celebrate that because you've not only allowed them to get to that stage, but now they found something for themselves that makes them happier. And so it does take a special type of leader to acknowledge even the exit be a good sort of event, because now, to your point, you've created that, or you've at least been part of that journey. And so that's really helpful. David, as we come to the close of this episode, as always, what would be one thing that you'd, for those listening in, one do and one don't on leadership that you would leave our audience with, whatever their format is in terms of public, private, sports, non-sports? What's the do and don't on leadership or leaders that you would want to leave us with?
So I would say, remember that you're a human being, not a human doing. And remember that means creating moments in your life where you can have that balcony moment, where you can self-reflect. Super, super important. And in order to make that useful, think about, if nothing else, think about that awareness and that sense of purpose that we talked about from the framework earlier. Who do I want to be? What do I want to stand for? What's important to me? How do I want others to experience me? So that when you're having your human being moments, you're asking yourself, you're reflecting on your own leadership practice, and you can course correct and you can grow through that process so that you as a leader are continually growing. Even the senior most leaders should still be growing. It's difficult from an external environment because we're now super senior and people think we've completed the journey, right? We should just be getting on with it. No, we should still be growing. And if the external environment isn't giving us the capability to do that, we create that capability for ourselves. We're all capable of that, regardless what role we occupy. So human being, reflective moments. How am I doing against the things that I said were important to me as a person and as a leader? Not just in the what, but in the how.
Love it. David, as always, thanks so much. Lots to unpack here for those listening. I think I've taken so many notes and I already thought I had a lot of notes. So I really enjoyed the conversation. In our next episode, we'll be wrapping this all up with how do leaders take peak performers and high-performing individuals to build high-performing teams, and where does that all take us to in terms of, the nirvana. So until then, we'll sign off for now. Thank you so much, David.
Pleasure as always. Nice to see you, Rohit. You don't just have a right to something, you have a responsibility to do something good on the back of getting something good. You would do yourself, your team, and your organization a tremendous service because awareness gives us choice. Again, my personal view is go with purpose as your North Star rather than legacy. In order to be your best for others, you have to first of all be your best for yourself.
Subscribe to the People Quotient channel where leadership meets action. Powerful conversations with practical insights that you can use right now. See you in the next episode.